Get out. Stay out of my house. The words hit Margaret like physical blows, each syllable dripping with venom from her daughter-in-law's perfectly glossed lips. Sarah stood in the doorway, arms crossed, designer handbag dangling from her wrist like a weapon of superiority. Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched her purse, the small gift she'd brought for her grandchild still wrapped inside. Behind Sarah, her son David stood silent, his eyes fixed on the marble floor she'd helped him pay for. The same floor where he'd taken his first steps 32 years ago. Did you hear me, old woman? This is my house now. The neighbors across the street had stopped their evening jog to stare. Mrs. Henderson from next door pretended to water her already drowning petunias. Margaret felt the weight of their judgment, the whispers that would follow. David, she whispered, hoping for just one word of defense from the boy she'd raised alone after his father died. But David remained silent, his jaw tight, his shoulders hunched in defeat or shame, she couldn't tell which anymore. Sarah's red nails drummed against the doorframe impatiently. The taxi's running, Sarah sneered. Don't let it wait on our dime. The leather seat was cold against Margaret's back as the taxi pulled away. Through the rear window, she watched the house, their house, grow smaller. The house where she'd nursed David through chicken pox, helped him with algebra, celebrated his graduation. Tears blurred her vision, but she couldn't stop looking back. The roses she'd planted last spring were blooming beautifully along the fence. The swing set David had insisted on keeping 4 future grandchildren sat empty in the backyard. Rough day? The driver asked gently, adjusting his rearview mirror. Margaret wiped her eyes with tissues from her purse, the same purse she'd carried to parent-teacher conferences, doctor appointments, and every milestone moment of David's life. I raised him alone, she whispered, more to herself than to the stranger behind the wheel. 18 years of packed lunches, bedtime stories, and sacrificed dreams. Working double shifts as a nurse so he could have the sneakers he wanted, the college education he deserved. She'd been mother and father both, never remarrying, never putting anyone before her son. The taxi turned the corner, and the house disappeared completely. Margaret closed her eyes and remembered David at 8 years old, arms wrapped around her neck. You're the best mom in the whole world. Margaret stared at her phone, David's number highlighted on the screen. It had been 3 days since the incident, 3 days of replaying every word, every silence. Her finger hovered over the call button. Finally, she pressed it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Her heart hammered against her ribs with each ring. Hello? David's voice was flat, guarded. David, sweetheart, it's Mom. The words tumbled out in a rush. I just wanted to talk about what happened. Maybe we could meet for coffee? That little place downtown where you used to get hot chocolate after your soccer games. Mom, I can't do this right now. But David, we need to. Sarah's upset. She thinks you were disrespectful coming over without calling first. Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. I was bringing Emma that book she wanted. I've always been welcome in your home. I helped you buy that home. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. She could hear Sarah's voice in the background, sharp and insistent, though she couldn't make out the words. I have to go, Mom. Sarah has dinner plans for us. The line went dead. Margaret stared at the phone until the screen went black, her reflection ghostly in the dark glass. Outside her apartment window, other families were sitting down to dinner together. Margaret? Margaret, is that you? Mrs. Henderson's voice carried across the produce section of the grocery store with the subtlety of a fire alarm. Margaret had been hoping to slip in and out unnoticed, but Eleanor Henderson had a radar for drama that could detect scandal from 3 aisles away. Oh, hello Eleanor. Margaret forced a smile, her hand instinctively smoothing her hair. Eleanor wheeled her cart closer, her eyes bright with barely contained curiosity. I couldn't help but notice the situation the other evening. At David's house? My Henry and I were out for our walk, and well. She leaned in conspiratorially. That girl's voice carries something fierce. Heat crept up Margaret's neck. She'd known this moment would come, had prepared for it, but the reality still stung. Family discussions can get heated sometimes. Oh honey, that wasn't a discussion. That was. Eleanor paused dramatically, that was something else entirely. The way she spoke to you. And David just standing there like a statue. After everything you've done for that boy. Other shoppers had begun to slow their pace, ears turned toward the conversation. Margaret felt exposed under the fluorescent lights, her private pain becoming public entertainment. I raised him better than that, Eleanor continued, shaking her head. Your late husband Robert would be turning in his grave. Margaret's composure cracked. Excuse me, Eleanor. I need to finish my shopping. Chapter 5, The Decision. Margaret sat in her small apartment that night, surrounded by photo albums and memories. Pictures of David's first day of school, his high school graduation, his wedding day where she'd walked him down the aisle. In every photo, she stood proud beside him, the devoted mother who'd given everything. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark kitchen window. 63 years old, gray hair neatly styled, laugh lines around green eyes that hadn't laughed much lately. She looked like what she was. A grandmother, a retired nurse, a woman who should be spending her golden years spoiling grandchildren and tending her garden. But something else looked back at her too. Something that had been forged in the fires of single motherhood, tempered by years of standing up to school bullies and insurance companies and every obstacle that had tried to knock down her son. The woman in the reflection wasn't weak. She'd built a life from nothing after Robert died, raised a son who'd graduated summa cum laude and landed a job at the city's most prestigious law firm. She'd been a force when she needed to be. Margaret leaned forward until her forehead touched the cool glass. Her breath fogged the window as she whispered words that seemed to come from someone else entirely. If they think I'm weak, they'll soon regret it. The reflection smiled back, and for the first time in days, Margaret felt something other than heartbreak. She felt powerful. The closet smelled of mothballs and memories. Margaret pulled down the old cedar box from the top shelf, her late husband's papers scattered inside like forgotten treasures. She'd avoided going through these documents for 15 years, the lawyer's copies feeling too final, too real. But now, sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor like a child with a treasure chest, she began to read with new purpose. The first document made her pause, the deed to David's house, still bearing Robert's name as primary owner, with herself listed as beneficiary. She'd forgotten about that detail in the chaos of grief and David's wedding planning. Next came stock certificates, shares in 3 companies that had grown substantially over the years. Margaret had assumed they'd been transferred to David somehow, but here they were, crisp and legal in her maiden name. Then the insurance policies, the bank account statements, the business partnership documents from Robert's small construction company. Paper after paper showing assets, properties, investments, all still legally hers. Margaret spread the documents across her comforter like a puzzle she was finally ready to solve. David had built his life on a foundation that still belonged to her, had married a woman who lived in a house that wasn't technically his to give. She reached for her reading glasses and began to study each document more carefully. If Sarah wanted to play games about ownership and control, Margaret was about to become a much more interesting opponent. James Patterson looked exactly like a lawyer should, silver-haired, wire-rimmed glasses, expensive suit that spoke of success and discretion. He'd handled Robert's affairs and had been encouraging Margaret for years to sort out the estate properly. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm delighted you finally came in. He gestured to the chair across from his mahogany desk. Though I suspect this isn't just a social call. Margaret placed the cedar box on his desk. I need to understand exactly what I own, James. Everything. For the next hour, James went through each document with meticulous care. With each explanation, Margaret felt a growing sense of amazement and power. The house on Maple Street is yours outright, James confirmed. Your son has been living there, but legally, he's your tenant. A tenant who's never paid rent, I might add. And the business accounts? Still require your signature for any major transactions. Robert set it up that way to protect the family assets. Very wise man, your husband. Margaret leaned forward. What would happen if I decided to exercise these rights? James removed his glasses and cleaned them carefully. Mrs. Hartwell, you're asking about something that could fundamentally alter your son's financial position. Are you certain you want to explore this path? Outside the office window, she could see the park where she used to take David to feed the ducks. Where he'd promised to take care of her when she got old, to never leave her alone. I'm certain, James. Tell me everything I need to know. Margaret stood on the familiar front porch, holding a casserole dish and wearing her most innocent smile. The doorbell's chime echoed inside the house, the same chime she'd helped pick out during the renovations. Sarah opened the door wearing yoga pants and an expression of supreme annoyance. Margaret. What are you doing here? I brought dinner for the family. David mentioned you've been working so much lately. Margaret held up the dish, steam still rising from under the foil cover. It's your favorite, my grandmother's chicken and rice casserole. We don't need your charity food. Sarah's voice dripped disdain. David's doing very well for himself. We can afford our own meals. Of course you can, dear. I just thought. You thought what? That you could guilt your way back into our lives? Sarah stepped onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind her. Let me make this crystal clear. David has moved on. He has a real family now, with me and Emma. We don't need some lonely old woman clinging to the past. Margaret nodded thoughtfully, as if considering Sarah's words. I see. And this is your final decision? Both of yours? It's our decision. David agrees completely. Well then. Margaret set the casserole dish on the porch swing. I suppose I should respect your wishes. I'll stop interfering in your life. Sarah's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Good. It's about time you accepted reality. Margaret smiled, genuinely this time. Oh, I'm accepting reality perfectly, Sarah. Have a lovely evening. As she walked back to her car, Margaret could feel Sarah watching from the window. Let her watch. Let her think she'd won. The car door closed with a satisfying click, and Margaret sat for a moment in the gathering dusk. Through the living room window, she could see David and Emma playing on the floor, building blocks scattered around them like colorful confetti. Her granddaughter had grown so much in just these few weeks of separation. Sarah appeared in the window, phone pressed to her ear, gesticulating wildly. Probably calling one of her friends to crow about putting the old woman in her place. Margaret could practically hear the conversation. You should have seen her face when I told her we didn't need her charity food. She just stood there and took it like the pathetic old bat she is. Margaret started the engine and pulled away slowly, watching the house in her rearview mirror. David came to the window briefly, looking out at her retreating car. For a moment, she thought he might run outside, might call her back, might remember the mother who'd given him everything. But he just stood there, one hand on the glass, before turning away. Margaret drove to the end of the street and parked under an oak tree she remembered David climbing as a boy. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to James Patterson's number. James? It's Margaret Hartwell. I've made my decision. Her voice was steady, calm, almost cheerful. I want you to draw up all the paperwork we discussed. Every single document. Are you absolutely certain, Margaret? Once we begin this process. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. They want me out of their house? Consider me out. Margaret smiled at her reflection in the side mirror. But I'm taking my house with me. Margaret's new checking account felt strange in her hands, sleek black debit card with her name embossed in silver letters. The bank manager, a young woman named Christine, had been professional and discreet as they'd transferred assets and updated beneficiaries. The automatic payments will stop processing from the old joint account within 48 hours, Christine explained. Mortgage, utilities, insurance, everything will require new payment arrangements from Mr. Hartwell. Margaret signed document after document, her signature flowing smoothly across lines that would change everything. With each signature, she felt something shifting inside her, grief transforming into purpose, hurt crystallizing into determination. "And the business accounts?" Margaret asked. "Frozen pending your authorization for any transactions over $500. The automatic transfers to his personal account have been suspended." Christine's voice remained neutral, but Margaret caught a glint of something, approval, in the young woman's eyes. Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from David: "Thanks for stopping by yesterday. Sorry Sarah was rude. Maybe we can talk soon?" Too little, too late. Margaret deleted the message without responding. "There's one more thing," Margaret told Christine. "I'd like to update my will. Remove David as beneficiary and establish a trust for my granddaughter instead. She should inherit when she turns 25. Christine nodded and made notes. "I'll have our estate attorney contact you this week." Margaret gathered her papers and stood, feeling lighter than she had in months. The old Margaret would have forgiven and forgotten, would have crawled back begging for scraps of affection. But the old Margaret had just signed her final document. David's phone call came at 7:43 a.m., waking Margaret from the first peaceful sleep she'd enjoyed in weeks. His voice was tight with confusion and barely controlled panic. "Mom, I need to ask you something. There's been some kind of mistake with the Riverside property. The buyers are saying the sale can't go through without your signature?" Margaret sat up in bed, adjusting her reading glasses and reaching for the water glass on her nightstand. She'd been expecting this call. "Good morning to you too, David. Which property are you referring to?" "The rental property on Riverside Avenue. The one Dad left me. I've had a buyer lined up for months. This sale was supposed to close today. But now the title company is saying there's an issue with the deed?" Margaret swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cool hardwood floor. "Oh, that property. Yes, James Patterson called me about that yesterday. Apparently, it's still in my name. Has been since your father died." Silence stretched across the phone line. Margaret could almost hear the gears turning in David's head, the lawyer in him beginning to understand the implications. "But Mom, I've been managing that property for 15 years. Collecting rent, handling maintenance, paying taxes." "Yes, you have. And I've appreciated the help. But David, did you really think I'd signed away everything your father left me? Without even discussing it? I assumed, when I got married, I thought." Margaret's voice remained pleasant, conversational. "Assumptions can be dangerous things, sweetheart. Especially in legal matters. I'm sure you learned that in law school." Margaret hadn't intended to overhear the fight. She'd simply come to retrieve the casserole dish she'd left on their porch 2 days earlier. But Sarah's voice carried through the thin walls of the house like a siren through fog. "A mama's boy with nothing. That's what I married." Margaret pressed herself against the brick wall beside the kitchen window, hidden by the rosebushes she'd planted the spring before David's wedding. She should leave, should give them privacy, but something kept her frozen in place. "Sarah, please. You're being unreasonable." "Unreasonable? Unreasonable?" Sarah's voice climbed to a shriek. "I gave up my career for this marriage. I moved to this godforsaken town because you promised me stability. You said your family had money. We do have money. This is just a temporary complication." "What money, David? What money? Your precious mama apparently owns everything. The house, the rental properties, probably the fucking air we breathe. And you just stood there like an idiot when I told her off." Margaret heard something crash, a plate, maybe, or a glass. Emma began to cry somewhere in the background. "Don't you dare blame me for your family's dysfunction," Sarah continued. "I should have listened to my mother. She said you were too attached to that woman, said it was creepy how close you were." "Don't talk about my mother like that." "Your mother? Your mother who's been pulling strings behind our backs?" Who's been letting us think we had financial security while she held all the cards? Margaret heard David's voice, lower now, dangerous in a way she'd never heard before. Sarah, you need to stop. Right now. But Sarah was past stopping. She's a manipulative old bitch who can't let go of her precious baby boy. And you're too weak to cut the cord. Margaret backed away from the window, her heart pounding. She'd heard enough. Margaret's hands were surprisingly steady as she set up the small recording device James had suggested she purchase. For your protection, he'd said. Document everything. The doorbell rang at precisely 2 p.m. Margaret had invited Sarah over for tea, suggesting they clear the air and work things out for David's sake. Sarah had agreed, probably eager for another opportunity to establish her dominance. Margaret. Sarah swept into the apartment wearing designer jeans and an expression of practiced patience. Thank you for reaching out. I think we both want what's best for David. Margaret smiled and gestured toward the living room. Of course, dear. Please, sit. I've made your favorite tea. Earl Grey, isn't it? For 20 minutes, they engaged in careful small talk. The weather, Emma's progress in preschool, Sarah's volunteer work at the country club. Margaret played the part of the contrite mother-in-law perfectly, nodding and agreeing and apologizing for any misunderstandings. Then she shifted the conversation.
Eleanor Hayes had raised 3 children, survived 2 decades of marriage, and built a successful catering business from nothing. At 62, she thought she'd seen every kind of disrespect. She was wrong. David asked me to drop off the insurance papers, she said, standing on the marble doorstep of her son's pristine suburban home. She held up the manila envelope, smiling warmly at her daughter-in-law. Melissa's perfectly manicured fingers gripped the doorframe. Her blonde hair was pulled back in an aggressive ponytail, her yoga outfit spotless despite the early hour. I don't care what David said. Eleanor blinked. I'm sorry. This is my house. Melissa's voice rose, each word sharp as broken glass. And I'm telling you right now, stay out of my house. The door slammed with such force that the decorative wreath shuddered. Eleanor stood frozen, the envelope trembling in her hands. Neighbors walking their dogs glanced over curiously. Heat flooded her cheeks as she realized they'd witnessed her humiliation. She drove home in silence, her heart pounding against her ribs. By the time she reached her driveway, something cold and calculating had settled in her chest. 2 weeks later, David's birthday barbecue should have been a celebration. Instead, it became Eleanor's second public humiliation. So then Eleanor just shows up at my door, again. Melissa laughed, gesturing dramatically with her wine glass. The extended family gathered around the patio table, hanging on her every word. I mean, some people just don't understand boundaries, right? Eleanor gripped her own glass tighter, watching faces around the table. David's Aunt Sarah nodded sympathetically. His cousin Mark chuckled uncomfortably. I was delivering papers David requested, Eleanor said quietly. Oh, Mom. David laughed nervously, not meeting her eyes. You know how Melissa values her privacy. Maybe next time just call first? The casual betrayal hit harder than Melissa's rudeness. Her own son, choosing his wife's narrative over the truth. Melissa smirked triumphantly, sensing victory. Exactly, Melissa continued.
It's about respect.
Some people think they can just waltz into your home whenever they please. Eleanor nodded slowly, maintaining her composure even as fury built behind her calm exterior. She raised her glass in a mock toast. You're absolutely right, Melissa. It is about respect. The words carried more weight than anyone realized. This would not stand. Eleanor's home office was sanctuary, walls lined with family photos spanning 4 decades, awards from the Chamber of Commerce, thank you letters from satisfied clients. She sat at her desk, legal pad before her, methodically listing everything she'd done for David and Melissa. Down payment assistance, $50,000. Wedding costs, $30,000. Emergency car repairs, $3,200. Babysitting for their anniversary trips, countless hours. Holiday hosting. 5 years running. The pen scratched against paper as she wrote, each entry fueling her resolve. She'd given her daughter-in-law every opportunity to build a relationship. Instead, Melissa had chosen warfare. Eleanor had survived her husband's death, raised 3 children alone, and built a business through sheer determination. She understood strategy, patience, and the art of the long game. Melissa thought she was dealing with a pushover grandmother. She was about to learn otherwise. Eleanor opened her laptop and began researching. Social media profiles, recent purchases visible through neighborhood apps, patterns of behavior she'd observed but never analyzed. Knowledge was power, and power required preparation. By midnight, she had 17 pages of notes and the skeleton of a plan. Melissa wanted to play games? Fine. But she'd chosen the wrong opponent. "I brought cookies," Eleanor announced cheerfully, holding up a tin of homemade chocolate chip treats. "David mentioned they were your favorites." Melissa opened the door reluctantly, suspicious, but unable to refuse without seeming overtly rude.
"Oh,
"Thank you." Eleanor stepped inside, taking careful inventory. Designer handbags casually draped over chairs, at least 3 she could see, each worth more than most people's monthly salary. Fresh flowers in crystal vases, clearly from an expensive florist. A stack of mail on the granite counter, several envelopes with past-due stamps visible. "Your home is just beautiful," Eleanor gushed, following Melissa to the kitchen. "That handbag is gorgeous, Hermes?" Melissa preened. "Yes, it was a birthday gift to myself. I work so hard, you know." "Of course you do, dear." Eleanor watched Melissa's face carefully. David's so lucky to have someone who manages the household finances so well. A micro-expression flickered across Melissa's features. Guilt?
panic?"
It was gone too quickly to be sure, but Eleanor filed it away. They made small talk for 20 minutes, Eleanor playing the harmless mother-in-law while mentally cataloging every detail. Melissa's guard dropped incrementally, her natural arrogance reasserting itself. As Eleanor left, she carried more than an empty cookie tin. She carried ammunition. The family trust meeting should have been routine, dividing grandmother's estate among the grandchildren. Eleanor arrived early, claiming the seat at the head of the conference table before Melissa could establish herself as the family financial expert. "I've reviewed the trust documents," Eleanor began, spreading papers with professional efficiency. "There are several tax implications we need to consider." Melissa shifted uncomfortably. She'd clearly expected to dominate this discussion, but Eleanor's decades of business experience showed. The lawyer, David's Uncle Robert, and even David himself listened intently as Eleanor outlined strategies for minimizing tax burden. "What about the timeline?" Melissa interjected, trying to regain control. "I think we should distribute everything immediately." "That would trigger unnecessary penalties," Eleanor replied smoothly. "A phased approach over 3 years saves approximately $15,000 in taxes. I've prepared a detailed analysis." She slid copies across the table. Melissa glanced at the numbers, clearly out of her depth but too proud to admit it. "Well," Melissa said stiffly, "I suppose that makes sense." David looked impressed. "Mom, I had no idea you understood trust law so well." Eleanor smiled modestly. "You learn a few things running a business for 30 years. Melissa's jaw tightened. Score 1 for experience over arrogance. The coffee shop near David's office was neutral territory, which made it perfect for Eleanor's meeting with Sarah, David's younger sister. Sarah arrived looking frazzled, her nurse's uniform wrinkled from a double shift. "Thanks for meeting me," Eleanor said, sliding a latte across the small table. "Of course." Sarah's exhaustion couldn't hide her curiosity. "Though I have to ask, what's this about?" Eleanor chose her words carefully. "I'm concerned about David. Have you noticed changes in him since the marriage?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "You mean how he barely talks to any of us anymore? How he canceled Christmas at your house because Melissa wanted to start their own traditions? How he hasn't been to a single family event without checking with her first? So you've noticed too." "She's isolating him, Mom. Classic control tactic." I see it all the time at the hospital, spouses who gradually cut their partners off from family and friends. Sarah leaned forward conspiratorially. She told David I was too involved in his life.
Me.
His sister? Eleanor nodded sympathetically. What else has she said? For the next hour, Sarah revealed a pattern of manipulation Eleanor had only partially glimpsed. Melissa criticized every family member behind their backs, invented slights to justify her hostility, and constantly positioned herself as the victim of an intrusive, extended family. We have to do something, Sarah concluded. Eleanor smiled. Leave that to me. The charity auction was Melissa's element: designer gowns, influential people, opportunities to network and show off. Eleanor bid strategically on a few items, playing the generous grandmother while observing the social dynamics. When the auctioneer announced the hospital wing naming opportunity, Melissa raised her paddle immediately. 50,000, she called out confidently. Eleanor watched the ripple of surprise through the crowd. David's face went pale. 50,000 was serious money. Money Eleanor suspected they didn't have. The bidding continued. Melissa, caught up in the attention, raised her paddle again. 75,000. More murmurs. David tugged at his wife's arm, whispering urgently. Melissa shook him off, drunk on the admiration of strangers. 100,000. Another bidder called out. Melissa hesitated. Eleanor could see the wheels turning, the desperate desire to win warring with dawning financial reality. Going once. The auctioneer began. Melissa lowered her paddle, forcing a bright smile as applause erupted for the winning bidder. But the damage was done. Eleanor had watched David's mortification, seen the confused glances from people who knew the family's actual financial situation. After the event, Eleanor overheard fragments of conversations. Thought they had money troubles. Seemed awfully confident for someone whose husband just got passed over for that promotion. Seeds of doubt, planted in public soil. Eleanor's book club was legendary in their social circle. Thoughtful discussions, excellent wine, and just enough gossip to keep things interesting. When she invited Melissa, it seemed like an olive branch. I thought you might enjoy meeting some of the women, Eleanor explained over the phone. We're discussing the 7 husbands of Evelyn Hugo this month. Melissa arrived overdressed and overconfident, clearly expecting to impress the group with her sophistication. Eleanor introduced her warmly, then settled back to watch the show. I actually know the author, Melissa announced within minutes, sipping wine with affected elegance. We went to college together. Eleanor's friend Janet raised an eyebrow. Really? What was Taylor Jenkins Reid like as a student? Melissa's confident smile faltered slightly. Oh, very creative. The women exchanged glances. Eleanor had briefed them carefully, not maliciously, just enough to let them draw their own conclusions. I thought she graduated from Emory, said Patricia, the retired librarian. Where did you go to school again? State, Melissa said quickly. Different years, of course. Of course, Janet agreed pleasantly. And your business. Remind me what you do. For the next hour, Melissa spun increasingly elaborate tales while the book club ladies listened with polite skepticism. Eleanor said little, letting her daughter-in-law dig her own grave with each embellishment. By evening's end, Melissa had claimed friendships with 3 celebrities, expertise in 4 different fields, and a business success that somehow never translated to actual proof. Eleanor's apology was masterfully crafted, sincere enough to seem genuine, humble enough to feed Melissa's ego. I've been doing some soul-searching, she said over lunch at Melissa's favorite restaurant. You were right about boundaries. I overstepped, and I'm sorry. Melissa's pleasure was barely concealed. Well, I appreciate that. It takes a big person to admit when they're wrong. I just want peace in our family, Eleanor continued, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. Maybe you could help me understand what I should do differently? For the next 2 hours, Melissa held court, explaining Eleanor's numerous failings and how she should behave going forward. Eleanor nodded contritely, occasionally asking for clarification, mentally recording every word. The conversation revealed more than Melissa intended. Her need for control went beyond normal preferences. She wanted to dictate when family could visit, which events they would attend, even which gifts were acceptable for the grandchildren. David's just so easily influenced, Melissa explained, cutting into her salmon. He needs someone strong to guide him. Eleanor murmured agreement while thinking about her son's college graduation speech, his promotion to regional manager, his natural leadership at work, all achievements that preceded Melissa's guidance. As they parted ways, Melissa was glowing with victory. Eleanor was gathering intelligence. That afternoon, she drove to David's office unannounced. David's office building had a small cafe on the ground floor where Eleanor occasionally met him for lunch. Today, she'd come early, hoping for a private conversation. "Mom," David seemed surprised but pleased. "What are you doing here?" "I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd buy my son coffee." They sat in a corner booth, and Eleanor studied her eldest child. He looked tired, stress lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before his marriage. "How are things, sweetheart?" "Really?" David's smile was forced. "Good. Fine. Just work stuff, you know." "The promotion still coming through?" His face darkened. "They went with someone else. More experience, they said." Eleanor's heart clenched. David had been counting on that promotion for months.
"I'm sorry, honey."
"That must be disappointing."
"Yeah, well."
He stirred his coffee unnecessarily. "Melissa's handling it better than I expected. She's always so good with money." Eleanor nearly choked. Based on her observations, Melissa's idea of financial management was buying designer handbags while bills went unpaid. But she kept her expression sympathetic. "That's wonderful that you have such support at home." "She's actually got this great investment opportunity," David continued, sounding like he was trying to convince himself. Her business partner found this amazing deal. Eleanor's internal alarm bells rang louder. Investment opportunity. Just some property thing. She's handling all the details. Eleanor nodded encouragingly while her mind raced. Property investments, mysterious business partners, and a woman who couldn't even accurately describe her supposed college education? This had disaster written all over it. The neighborhood block party was an annual tradition, and this year Melissa had volunteered to coordinate food donations. Eleanor arrived with her famous potato salad and a growing sense of anticipation. "Eleanor." Mrs. Chun from down the street hurried over. "We have a problem." Melissa told everyone to bring desserts, but she told the Wilson family to handle all the food. "Now we have 17 different cakes and no main dishes." Eleanor surveyed the dessert table, an impressive array of cookies, pies, and cakes, but not a single sandwich or casserole in sight. Families were starting to arrive with hungry children and no real food to offer them. "Where's Melissa?" Eleanor asked. "Inside, trying to order pizza for 60 people. She seems flustered." Through the kitchen window, Eleanor could see Melissa on the phone, gesturing wildly at someone off-screen. Her face was red with frustration. Eleanor sprung into action. "I'll call my catering crew. Give me 15 minutes." She made 3 quick phone calls, then addressed the growing crowd of confused neighbors. "Small communication mix-up, but we'll have proper food here shortly. In the meantime, let the kids enjoy the desserts." Within 20 minutes, Eleanor's team arrived with grilled chicken, fresh salads, and sandwich fixings. The party was saved. Melissa emerged from the house, looking harried and defensive. "I had everything under control," she announced to no one in particular. Mrs. Wilson patted Eleanor's arm. "Thank goodness you were here. I don't know what would have happened otherwise." Eleanor smiled modestly, while Melissa's jaw tightened visibly. Eleanor's coffee dates became strategic meetings. First Sarah, then David's cousin Mark, followed by several family friends who'd grown tired of walking on eggshells around Melissa. At Patricia's kitchen table, the book club ladies shared their observations from Melissa's disastrous evening. "The lying was so obvious," Janet said, shaking her head. "College friends with celebrities, a successful business that no one can verify, expertise in everything from wine to investments." "What bothers me most is how she talks about David," added Patricia. "Like he's a child who can't make decisions without her approval." Eleanor's sister Linda flew in from Phoenix for what she claimed was a casual visit. Over dinner, she revealed her true purpose. "David called me last month," Linda said. "He sounded so defeated, Eleanor. He wanted to know if you'd said anything about feeling unwelcome in their home." "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you love him and want to be part of his life, but you're hurt by how you've been treated." He seemed surprised, like he hadn't considered your feelings at all. The network was growing. Even David's best friend Mike, who'd been systematically excluded from family events, was ready to share what he'd witnessed. She intercepts his calls, Mike revealed during a quick lunch. "I'll call David's cell, and somehow Melissa always answers. She says he's busy, takes messages he never gets. I've started texting instead, but even those don't always reach him." Eleanor filed away each piece of information, building a comprehensive picture of systematic isolation and control. Eleanor's grandchildren, David's twins, aged 8, loved spending Saturdays at her house. She'd watch them while their parents handled errands, maintaining the relationship despite Melissa's obvious reluctance. This particular Saturday, young Emma burst into tears when Eleanor suggested making cookies. "We can't," Emma sobbed. "Mommy says you're trying to make us fat like her old babysitter." Eleanor knelt beside the distraught child, her heart breaking. "Sweetheart, I would never try to hurt you. I love you. But Mommy says you don't like her, and you want Daddy to divorce her so you can control everything." Eleanor's blood ran cold. A 8-year-old should know words like divorce or understand concepts like control manipulation. She held Emma close, whispering reassurances while her mind processed this new level of toxicity. When David arrived to pick up the children, Eleanor requested a private word. "We need to talk about what the kids are being told about me," she said carefully. David's face flushed. "Mom, Melissa's just protecting them from adult problems." "What adult problems, David?" "The problem of having a grandmother who loves them." The conversation grew heated, with David defending his wife's right to share her feelings with her children and Eleanor pointing out the damage being done to innocent kids caught in the middle. When Melissa arrived to hurry the process along, her false sweetness couldn't hide her satisfaction at the visible tension between mother and son. But Emma hugged Eleanor goodbye and whispered, "I don't think you're mean, Grandma. I think Mommy is wrong." Eleanor's business connections proved invaluable. A lunch with her accountant friend Helen revealed exactly what she'd suspected about Melissa's property investment. "It's a classic pyramid scheme," Helen explained, showing Eleanor the promotional materials David had nervously brought to her for a second opinion. "They prey on people who want quick returns without understanding market basics." Eleanor studied the glossy brochures promising 15% monthly returns on real estate flips. "How much are they asking for?" "Minimum investment is $50,000. Eleanor nearly choked on her wine. $50,000 they didn't have, invested in a scheme that would collapse within months. David's financial future and her grandchildren's security hung in the balance. That evening, she called a family meeting under the pretense of discussing holiday planning. "Before we get to Christmas," Eleanor said once everyone had gathered in her living room, "I want to discuss something I learned about today. There are some investment scams targeting our area, and I'm concerned about everyone's financial safety." She outlined the pyramid scheme without mentioning names, watching Melissa's face grow progressively paler. "The victims usually lose everything," Eleanor concluded. "The promise of quick returns is always too good to be true." David shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, how do you know all this?" 40 years in business teaches you to spot fraud, sweetheart." Melissa's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. The betrayal came from an unexpected source, Melissa's own sister, Claire, who'd driven down from Seattle for a surprise visit. Eleanor encountered Claire at the grocery store, clearly upset and eager to talk. "I'm so embarrassed about Melissa's behavior," Claire said without preamble. "David seems like such a nice man, and she's treating your whole family terribly." They talked for an hour in the parking lot, Claire revealing years of watching Melissa manipulate relationships and burn bridges. "She did the same thing to our parents," Claire explained. "Created drama, played victim, gradually cut them off from seeing their grandchildren." They died thinking she hated them, but really she just couldn't stand sharing control. Eleanor's heart ached for these unknown grandparents, isolated from their family by the same tactics being used against her. She's convinced David that you're the problem, Claire continued. But from what I've seen this week, you've been nothing but kind. She talks about you constantly, obsesses over every interaction, every conversation. It's not healthy. Claire agreed to help, providing insider information about Melissa's fears, insecurities, and plans. The ally Eleanor never expected became her most valuable source of intelligence. That evening, at the family dinner Melissa had organized to show off for her sister, Claire made several pointed comments about the importance of extended family relationships. Eleanor watched Melissa's growing paranoia as her own sister seemed to side against her. Eleanor's test was elegantly simple. She announced plans for a surprise 60th wedding anniversary party for David's great-aunt Ruth and great-uncle Joe, beloved family members who'd been married nearly 6 decades. "I'll handle everything," Eleanor announced at Sunday dinner. "Food, decorations, guest list. All I need is for everyone to keep the secret." Melissa immediately interjected. "Oh, I should coordinate this. I have so much experience with party planning." Eleanor smiled graciously. "That's so sweet of you to offer, but I know how busy you are with your business." "No, really, I insist. These kinds of events require professional touches." "Well," Eleanor pretended to consider. "If you're sure you have time, I suppose we could work together." They agreed to meet the following Tuesday to plan details. Eleanor knew exactly what would happen. Melissa would try to take complete control, probably suggesting expensive vendors and elaborate themes that would drive costs beyond Eleanor's deliberately modest budget. The meeting went exactly as predicted. Melissa arrived with Pinterest boards and vendor quotes, transforming Eleanor's simple family gathering into an extravagant production. "The flowers alone will be $3,000, Melissa announced confidently. "And we absolutely must hire that string quartet I heard at the Johnsons' anniversary." Eleanor let her talk, taking notes, asking thoughtful questions. Then she dropped the bomb. "This all sounds beautiful, but I should mention, Ruth and Joe specifically asked for something simple. Joe's been struggling since his heart attack, and Ruth told me she'd be mortified by anything fancy." Melissa's face fell as her elaborate plans crumbled against the reality of what the honored guests actually wanted. Eleanor's sabotage was subtle but effective. She began by being consistently unavailable when Melissa needed help with family logistics, babysitting requests declined due to prior commitments, recipe sharing delayed by mysteriously busy schedules. When Melissa volunteered to host Thanksgiving, Eleanor was supportive but unhelpful. "I'm sure you'll do wonderfully," she said warmly. "You won't need any advice from me." Without Eleanor's decades of hosting experience, Melissa struggled. The turkey was overcooked, the timing was off, and several side dishes never made it to the table. Guests arrived to chaos and left hungry. Eleanor brought a simple green bean casserole and spent the evening helping in the kitchen while Melissa grew increasingly frazzled. "Next year, maybe we should go back to your house," David suggested to Eleanor as they cleaned up. Melissa's objection was sharp and immediate. "We're perfectly capable of hosting holidays." But the doubt was planted. Several relatives made pointed comments about missing Eleanor's traditional spread. The pattern continued through December. Melissa's Christmas light display, installed without David's input, overloaded circuits and left their house dark for 3 days. Her gift-giving strategy focused on expensive items that impressed strangers but missed what family members actually wanted. Eleanor gave thoughtful, personal gifts that showed decades of knowing and loving each recipient. By New Year's Eve, the contrast was clear to everyone except Melissa herself. The breaking point came during a family crisis. Eleanor's sister Linda was hospitalized with pneumonia, and Eleanor flew to Phoenix to help coordinate her care. David wanted to join her, but Melissa created obstacles. Work commitments she'd scheduled without consulting him, social obligations that couldn't be moved, reasons why his presence wasn't actually necessary. "Your mom has everything under control," she told him over dinner, while Eleanor sat vigil at Linda's bedside. "Besides, Aunt Linda barely knows you." Eleanor called David from the hospital. "Linda's asking for you," she said simply. "She'd love to see you if you can make it." David looked at his wife across their pristine dining room table. "I should go, Mel. She's family. I already told the Hendersons we'd go to their party this weekend. How would that look?" For the first time, David seemed to really hear what his wife was saying. His aunt was critically ill, and Melissa was concerned about social appearances. "I'm going to Phoenix," he said quietly. Melissa's mask slipped. "If you choose her over me again, David, there will be consequences." The ultimatum hung in the air between them. David stared at his wife, perhaps seeing clearly for the first time in years. "There shouldn't be a choice between supporting my sick aunt and keeping my wife happy," he said finally. "The fact that you see it that way says something I'm not sure I like." He booked a flight that night. The annual family reunion was Eleanor's stage for the final act. 3 generations gathered at the community center, including relatives who rarely saw each other but maintained strong bonds through Eleanor's decades of relationship nurturing. Melissa arrived determined to establish herself as the family's new matriarch. She'd prepared talking points about modernizing traditions and bringing fresh perspectives to family dynamics. Her speech was a disaster. "I think it's time this family moved beyond some of its outdated patterns," she began, addressing the room like a corporate boardroom. "For too long, certain people have dominated decision-making without considering how their actions affect others." The room grew uncomfortable as relatives realized she was indirectly attacking Eleanor, who'd spent 40 years organizing these reunions. Great Uncle Joe, 91 and sharp as ever, stood up slowly. "Young lady, are you referring to Eleanor? Because if you are, you're addressing the woman who held this family together after my brother died, who organized support when half of us lost jobs in the recession, and who's never missed a birthday, graduation, or crisis in 50 years. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Melissa's face flushed. "I'm not attacking anyone," she backpedaled. "I'm just suggesting that healthy families evolve." Eleanor's cousin Martha stood next. "Eleanor evolved this family into something beautiful. What exactly are you suggesting we evolve into?" By the end of the gathering, Melissa had inadvertently revealed her disdain for the family's history, traditions, and the woman who'd preserved both for decades. The damage to her reputation was irreversible. The final betrayal came from Melissa's closest confidant, her friend Tracy, who'd been Melissa's partner in criticizing Eleanor for months. But Tracy had her own relationship with David, having known him since college, and she'd grown uncomfortable with the campaign against his mother. Tracy requested a private meeting with Eleanor at a neutral location. "I need to tell you some things," Tracy began nervously, fidgeting with her coffee cup. "Melissa's been saying things about you that I don't think are fair." For the next hour, Tracy revealed the extent of Melissa's character assassination campaign. The lies went far beyond simple complaints. Melissa had painted Eleanor as manipulative, controlling, even mentally unstable. "She told me you threatened to cut David out of your will if he didn't divorce her," Tracy admitted. "She said you hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on her past." Eleanor listened with growing amazement at the creative fiction her daughter-in-law had constructed. "None of that is true," Eleanor said simply. "I know. That's why I'm here." Tracy pulled out her phone. "I recorded our last conversation. I was starting to suspect she was lying about a lot of things, and I wanted proof." She played several audio clips of Melissa fabricating increasingly elaborate stories about Eleanor's supposed harassment. The lies were so outrageous they bordered on delusional. "David needs to hear this," Tracy concluded. "He has a right to know what his wife is saying about his mother." Eleanor agreed, but insisted Tracy make the revelation herself. It would carry more weight coming from Melissa's own friend. The confrontation happened at David's house on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Tracy had asked for a family meeting to clear the air about some misunderstandings. Eleanor arrived to find David and Melissa in their living room, both looking puzzled but curious. Tracy looked nervous, but determined. "I need to play you some recordings," Tracy announced without preamble. Melissa's voice filled the room, describing elaborate schemes Eleanor had supposedly orchestrated to destroy her marriage. David's face grew pale as he heard his wife accuse his mother of everything from financial manipulation to psychological warfare. "This is private conversation," Melissa protested, her voice shrill. "You had no right to record me." "Actually, I did," Tracy replied coolly. "Single party, consent state. And David deserved to know what you've been saying about his mother." Eleanor sat quietly, letting the recordings speak for themselves. Melissa's lies were so excessive they required no rebuttal. David turned to his wife, his voice eerily calm. "Is any of this true? Has my mother done any of the things you described?" Melissa's mouth opened and closed silently. Caught in her web of deception, she had no defense except attack. "She's manipulated all of you," she finally screamed. "Can't you see what she's doing? She wants to control your entire family." Eleanor spoke for the first time since arriving. "Melissa, all I ever wanted was to love my son and be part of his life. If that feels threatening to you, maybe the problem isn't me." The simple truth hit harder than any accusation could have. Melissa's desperation led to increasingly erratic behavior. She began calling David's workplace, claiming family emergencies to pull him out of important meetings. She contacted extended family members with wild stories about Eleanor's supposed campaign against her. The stories were so outlandish that they backfired spectacularly. Instead of gaining sympathy, Melissa revealed her own instability. The final straw came when she called Child Protective Services, claiming Eleanor had been inappropriate with the grandchildren. The investigation was swift and thorough and completely vindicated Eleanor while raising serious questions about Melissa's mental state. "False reports to CPS are a serious matter," the social worker explained to David. "This kind of weaponizing of our services suggests someone who's lost perspective on appropriate conflict resolution." David was horrified. She did what? The CPS report became the catalyst David needed to seek professional help, not for Eleanor, but for understanding how his marriage had become so toxic. The counselor's assessment was clear. Melissa displayed patterns consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, including grandiosity, lack of empathy, and a desperate need for control that manifested as isolation tactics against her husband's family. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in being proven right. She'd gained her son back, but at the cost of his marriage and her grandchildren's stability. The victory was hollow, tainted by the wreckage of what could have been a happy family if only one person had chosen love over control. David's apology came on a rainy Tuesday evening. He appeared at Eleanor's door looking exhausted, older than his 42 years, carrying the weight of 3 years of poor choices. "I failed you," he said simply. "I failed as a son, as a father, as a man." Eleanor hugged him tightly, feeling the tension leave his shoulders as he finally allowed himself to acknowledge the truth he'd been denying. "I couldn't see it," he continued, sitting in her familiar kitchen. "She made every conflict seem like it was about us versus them, our marriage versus your interference. I thought I was being a good husband by choosing her side." "You were trying to make your marriage work," Eleanor said gently. "That's not wrong. But I abandoned my children, my family, my own judgment." His voice broke. "The kids have been so confused, Mom. Emma asked me why you stopped loving them because that's what Melissa told them." Eleanor's heart ached for her grandchildren, innocent victims of adult warfare. "She tried one more manipulation," David continued. "Threatened to take the kids and move across the country unless I cut contact with you completely. That's when I realized a loving partner doesn't make you choose between them and your family. A loving partner becomes part of your family." David had filed for divorce and sought emergency custody of the twins, citing Melissa's false CPS report and documented pattern of alienation tactics. The legal battle would be difficult, but David finally had clarity about what he was fighting for. Eleanor's masterstroke was years in the making, and Melissa never saw it coming. When David's divorce proceedings began, Eleanor produced comprehensive documentation of every interaction, every incident, every financial decision that had raised red flags. Her careful record-keeping revealed patterns of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and systematic isolation that supported David's custody petition. But the real revelation came when Eleanor's lawyer subpoenaed financial records. The mysterious property investment, Melissa had pushed was indeed a pyramid scheme, and she'd invested their children's college funds without David's knowledge. $58,000, the forensic accountant reported. Gone completely. The investment company dissolved 3 months ago, taking everyone's money. Eleanor had saved her son from financial ruin by documenting her concerns and helping him seek professional advice before it was too late to recover the funds. More devastating for Melissa was the discovery that Eleanor had been quietly setting up college funds for the grandchildren from her own resources. While Melissa gambled away their education money, their grandmother had been securing their future. "You knew?" David asked, amazed by his mother's foresight. "I suspected. I hoped I was wrong, but I wanted to protect the children either way." Eleanor's reputation for wisdom and family loyalty was permanently established, while Melissa's credibility crumbled under the weight of financial recklessness and deception. The woman who'd tried to destroy Eleanor's relationship with her family had instead revealed her own true character. 6 months later, Eleanor's kitchen was filled with laughter again. David had custody of the twins, who were rebuilding their relationship with their grandmother without the poison of adult manipulation. "Grandma, will you teach me to make your famous cookies?" Emma asked, standing on a stool beside Eleanor at the counter. "Of course, sweetheart. The secret ingredient is love." Emma giggled. "That's what you always say." "Because it's always true." David entered the kitchen, looking healthier than he had in years. "Mom, I can never thank you enough for not giving up on us." Eleanor hugged her son, remembering the broken man who'd stood on her doorstep months earlier. "Family doesn't give up on family, sweetheart. That's what makes us strong." Melissa had moved back to her hometown, defeated but not destroyed. Eleanor hoped she'd find the help she needed to build healthier relationships in the future. The children would visit her summers, maintaining that connection despite everything that had happened. "What's the most important thing I taught you through all this?" Eleanor asked David as they watched the twins play in the backyard. David considered carefully. "That real love doesn't require you to choose sides. Real love makes the circle bigger, not smaller." Eleanor smiled, satisfied that the lesson had finally taken root. Her P. The family was whole again, scarred but wiser, bound together by something more powerful than any attempt to tear them apart. Love had won.